finance.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience while we were setting up this call. A very important conversation with former Congressman Barney Frank, who is now in the US, outside Boston, where he lives. He was the House Finance Chair between 2007 and 2011, very much a part of the US financial services industry, as well as the overall economy's construction in the crisis that took place in the 2007-2008 period. A very core member of the Obama administration. And now I'm very, very pleased to be able to reconnect with Congressman Barney Frank and tap his mind in terms of what he sees the new administration will be faced with. The conversation that we want to have today will focus on Barney's perception of the different personalities that the new Biden administration is putting together, and also on some of the key issues that all of us outside of the United States would be interested to know. And I've known Barney and Jim for several years now. We've become very good friends, and I've tapped on his thoughts on the developments taking place in the US, even right through the previous administration. And I'm very excited to have this conversation with Barney to get a sense of how the first 100 days, the get-go of the new administration is going to look like. And as all of us know, there are a number of very important agendas, many of which are domestic to the US, but some of which are very important to the rest of the world as well. So I want to focus the conversation with Barney firstly on the personalities that are being brought together for this new administration, and then from there, how they're likely to act out in terms of legislation, in terms of the economy, in terms of domestic policy and rebuilding the economy and so on, and also trade and what's happening globally. So this is going to be a very interesting conversation. You are invited to send questions by text into the Zoom call. And when I see them, I will sort of consolidate the questions and into the conversation so that we can cover as much ground as possible. So Barney, good to see you again on Zoom. And thank you for doing this session with us.
I always enjoy these sessions that you've done.
Yeah. So now and we've had this conversation before, we have rehearsed it in many different ways over the years. Now with the new Biden administration coming together, I guess the first question that anyone talking to you would be interested in would be, you left the administration having put together the landmark legislation, the Dodd-Frank Act, and now an entire new team is coming together to take it to another level, and also they have a number of other agendas that they're taking to another level: healthcare, infrastructure, the economy, and so on. So let's just start very quickly. In what is your first sense of the lineup that the Biden administration has put together? In terms of the whole nominees and appointees, for the new administration. So we have Kamala Harris, of course, but we also have Pete Buttigieg, and we have Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary. Let's start with Janet Yellen and her relationship and role change that is going to be taking place, having been a Federal Reserve Bank chairman, and then now on the other side of the fence as Treasury Secretary.
Well, I think she's very much in sync with Joe Biden, and in fact, she in many ways symbolizes or typifies the evolution they've taken. To start, you're going to see in the Biden administration, I think, something very close to the Obama administration in general, except moved somewhat to the left. He doesn't face the political constraints that Obama faced because Senator Mitch McConnell, who led that opposition to Obama, has been greatly weakened for a variety of reasons. And there is also, I think, in the country after COVID, and the role that the government had to play there, broadly supported, there's going to be more support for government activism. Janet Yellen herself typifies this. A few years ago, when she was a member of the Federal Reserve, when she was chair, she said, well, we have to be careful not to let unemployment drop too low, to be honest. She said, we might have to check employment. And there was a point when she was pushing up interest rates for fear that diminished unemployment would generate inflation. Along with most other economists, and particularly on the left, she no longer worries about that to that extent. There's a recognition that unemployment now can go much lower than was previously thought under the Phillips curve, as it was called, and not worry about inflation. So she will be very much in line with Obama's, for instance, that nearly $2 trillion plan he proposed yesterday. She'll be very supportive of that. The Fed will be working very closely with the Treasury Department, and Janet Yellen personally symbolizes that. I think she's the first Treasury Secretary to have been a Fed chair. I think it had gone the other way around. So, yeah, you're going to see very much support. She will also be very supportive, as she was when she was Fed chair, of the regulations in the what's called the Dodd-Frank bill. And by the way, in that context, and I neglected to mention yesterday when we talked, significant is that Chris Dodd, the co-author, obviously, of Dodd-Frank, is very close to Joe Biden. He was the chair of the committee to pick or to recommend vice presidents. So we start out with that strong favorability. And Janet Yellen, the Trump administration did not weaken Dodd-Frank very much. They talked about doing so, but they recognized it was politically unpopular to weaken it. But to the extent that they made some minor ticks in that, Janet Yellen will restore them.
Right. How would you describe Janet Yellen's relationship with Powell, Jeremy Powell? Because she's now on the side of the fence to want to expand spending, and and some things have worked in favor of the administration coming in. Treasury rates have gone up slightly. Hopefully it will hold up inflation quite well, and so on. Some things in the economy seems to be helping the process along quite well. But how would you describe the relationship they're likely to have?
It'll be a very close relationship, even though they, from different parties. The fact is that when Janet Yellen was a member of the board after her chairmanship, she and Powell got along well. And I think you will see, in fact, the thing is, Chairman Powell has sounded more like a Democrat these days, in that he has been for some time now saying, look, to the Congress, we're doing as much as we can to be stimulative and accommodative with monetary policy, with the various forms of injection of funds into the economy, but we can't do it alone. We can't do it without you. And he has been a strong advocate of fiscal stimulus. He also, remember, broke with the Trump administration when Treasury Secretary Mnuchin decided to curtail some of the programs as of the end of last year that had been instituted by Congress to stimulate the economy. And Powell differed with that. He had to give in because of the way the law was. So Powell, although he was appointed by Trump and as a Republican, I think is also very much in line with the administration's thinking. And I think he and Yellen will have a very good personal relationship as well.
The equity market is, it's a runaway at the moment, and then there is infrastructure spending. There seemed to be a kind of a need to bring Main Street with Wall Street together again. Right now, how do you think that's going to play out? What do you think the issues are? And who are the personalities that are going to shape that?
That's a critical question. Biden understands it. That's why he stressed yesterday that his first package legislatively is to get more money into the pockets of average citizens, raising that stipend from $600 to $2,000. You will see, I think, on Biden's part, a serious effort to make sure that average Americans are benefited. First of all, in the direct subsidy. I think you'll see soon later on infrastructure, which you mentioned, which puts a lot of people to work, including non-college educated people. And I think you will see an extension of Medicare, not Medicare for all, that was really never realistically on the table. But you will see an expansion of Medicare, maybe lowering the age to 60, maybe even into the high 50s. So Biden will be doing a lot to try to do that. I should say the one area I was talking about how the Biden administration will be, the Obama administration moved a couple of degrees to the left because economic thinking has changed about the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, seeing much less of a trade-off. And secondly, there's more of an understanding and a willingness to support government. The major disjunction between Obama and Biden will be on trade. You will not see an immediate renewal of TPP as it then was. I think you've seen a great evolution. Biden will be unwilling to go forward with more trade until and unless he's gotten some of those protections for non-college educated people who tend to be hurt by some of the trade, and he would want to insulate them from that harm before he expanded it.
Yeah, I want to dive deep into trade. But before I do that, just this question of how left do you think the Biden administration will be willing to go, and maybe where does Bernie Sanders stand in this whole thing, or rather the Bernie Sanders thinking, where will we go all the way left and embrace that wholly, or will there be somewhat of a control in that whole process?
First of all, it was never going to go as far left as the Republicans claimed. There was never going to be the Green New Deal or Medicare for all. In the first place, people forget. And I have to say to some of my friends on the left who argue how much we should listen to the people. Yeah, well, among the people you seem to not want to listen to are the majority of voters in the Democratic primary who picked Joe Biden over the candidate you preferred. Biden comes in with a very solid popular majority among Democrats to expand Medicare, but not wipe out private insurance, for example. And that's been reinforced by the election, which was somewhat close. And to his credit, because I've often differed with his approach to things, Senator Sanders realizes this because he's going to be chairman of the Budget Committee. Frankly, I think the fact that that was on the line was one of his incentives to be much more supportive of Biden in November than he had been of Hillary Clinton 4 years earlier. And he has himself said, as chair of the Budget Committee, he's kind of dividing his approach. He will work with Biden to implement the expansions of Medicare and infrastructure and those sort of mainstream liberal positions. He will continue to advocate going much further, but he won't try to hold the rest of the program hostage to get that. He'll be running a two-track thing, which is doable. He will help implement the Biden agenda, which is Obama a couple degrees to the left, and he will then on a separate track advocate going much further. And I think that'll get general support. I think, as I said, Sanders now, one of the sayings that has gotten things wrong, it seems to me, was Lord Acton, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think in our system and in other democratically run systems, it's the opposite. What corrupts is not having any power. Not having responsibility encourages politicians to act irresponsibly. When people are given power and there are consequences to their actions, they get more responsible. So Bernie Sanders, chair of the Budget Committee in a Senate that's very closely divided will be a much more politically realistic operative than Bernie Sanders as the lone voice in the wilderness.
Okay, so give the guy the driving seat and give him the steering wheel, and you'll behave very differently, right?
He's worked with except Donald Trump.
Except for Donald Trump. But you went on record last year saying that you wouldn't like to see Elizabeth Warren in the driving seat, and now she isn't. So will that sort of play a role in how she perceives what needs to be done? Will she be pushing for?
No, I think leader in this. The position that Sanders is at now, frankly, Elizabeth Warren has always understood. In fact, she's had some influence. Yes, she advocates some positions to the left, although, remember, she understood the impracticality, both politically and operationally, of Medicare for all. And during the campaign, one of the problems she had was she tried to bridge that by saying, well, yes, the goal is Medicare for all, but here's how we will approach it. And she tried to sort of take an incremental approach to the radical change, and that cost her on both sides. But she's always been very realistic and respected by her colleagues. Sanders, over the time, has not been a major player in the actual operation of the Senate, although that'll change when he's chair of the committee. Elizabeth Warren, from the day she got there, was much more operational. She was the model of how you could have these further extensive goals, but work within what is politically possible. And frankly, I think she will emerge as one of the leaders in the Senate in helping Biden and at the same time kind of nudging him to the left.
Right. So from what you're telling me, okay, let's take tax reform. And this is something that the market has been quite afraid of, which is Biden has promised tax increases, right?
The market is afraid of paying taxes.
Right. So how far do you think that will go? I mean, if you're saying to me that they're not going to go all the way left.
Starting with Bill Clinton, there's been a Democratic Republican alteration on the top individual rate between the mid-30s and the high 30s, moving a few points. But a few points at that level can mean a lot of money. Yes, I think Biden will push and will succeed in getting the top tax rate back up close to 40% individually. He will also, I believe, increase the corporate tax rate and probably the capital gains rate, but not to where they had been. I think you may see both of those go up into the mid-20s. I do think, because it's taken on a great symbolic value, that the Democrats, I hope, and I think they will finally change the tax law to make it explicit that carried interest is to be taxed as capital gains and not as operational profit from the hedge funds. So I think you will see increases, 15 increases of 5% out of 100% in the top rate, the top in the top individual rate, and in the corporate and capital gains tax rates.
Well, are there any items in the Trump bill, expense bill, which can be cut down? I saw that Trump signed off on a $700 billion Space Force budget. That sounds to me like a huge deal.
I don't see a decrease in the rate of increase in the military. I hope it will even stabilize or go down. One of the paradoxes of Trump was he talked, I thought, correctly, that we were not getting enough support from our allies in military spending, and that we were sort of giving Europe a free ride, and to some extent Japan, and he wanted them to pay more. And I'm for that. I've been for that for a long time. The problem is that the correlation of that is that you then can cut American spending. And he has done both. He's complained that we're spending too much vis-a-vis the others, but then he increases our spending. One, that removes their incentive to spend more. So there was that. There's another area, by the way, every year, the last couple, Trump has increased like $30 or $40 billion federal spending to compensate American farmers for the damage he had done to them by his trade policies with China in particular. Trump's trade policies hurt American farmers. Now, maybe those were good policies or not, but nobody can deny they hurt American farmers. And this great free enterprise, the way he dealt with that was to increase the most wasteful anti-market program in the federal budget, which is farm subsidies. So yes, you can cut back on that. Actually, I would hope he would undo this Trump creation of the US Space Force. We now have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Space Force. That's not more expensive in hardware, but it certainly is administratively. The other area is this. The Republicans have greatly relaxed the constraint of the budget deficit. When Obama was there, he had to worry about the deficit. Politically, I think economically, it has long been exaggerated as a problem. That is, I think our country has a capacity to carry, more debt. One side thing on the debt, we do the federal debt differently than anybody else in the world does debt. Anybody else in the world, private sector, public sector, if you do a long-term physical improvement, that doesn't count the same as an immediate short-term expenditure. The federal government builds roads, and that counts the same as a direct expenditure for salary. We don't take into account the long-term benefits of that. But in any case, the budget deficit has just exploded under Trump. It has clearly meant nothing to the Republicans. To quote the Cheney, who's not in the news these days, Dick Cheney, the vice president, he said deficits don't matter. And I think he was right politically and much closer to right economically than his critics. At any rate, Biden, if the Republicans start to object to some of Biden's programs on the grounds they're going to add to the deficit, they will be totally non-credible given their own record.
This is uncharted territory. I mean, we are now entering a realm where the deficit and the total debt is larger than the GDP. So so we stop counting at this point, right?
Well, you may also argue that there are different kinds of debt. People say, well, what are you doing to future generations if you build up this debt? Well, if the result is that future generations have a much better transportation system, much less damage to the climate, that's a good thing. Yeah, it's true when you buy a house, you get into debt, but you got a house.
Yeah. In fact, on that point, two things. I noticed that the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, and the Trade Secretary, rather the Agriculture Secretary, these are guys with, grassroots background, right? Ex-labor, ex-union, people who worked on the ground and holding it that way. And also something that is not said pointed out very clearly is that the Biden administration is planning for $1 trillion worth of infrastructure spending, right? And that's going to be going into local government. And
by the way, that spending in the federal government, it's, as I said, it's the same as operational day to day. But in any other entity, it would be capital improvements. And you budget
capital improvements
than you do for daily operations. But one other, we were talking about the administration and who they are. And before we run out of time, I do want to say one very important signal has been given that this is going to be a very fair but tough administration of the Dodd-Frank bill. There were two very rigorous...
I'm coming to that, but anyway, keep going, yeah.
Well, there were the two toughest regulators, but also fair, I believe, and accurate under Obama. One was Sheila Bair at the FDIC. The other was Gary Gensler, who was chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He is the first regulatory appointment that Biden has announced. He's going to be head of the SEC, which is the most important of the corporate regulators. And that is that in itself, and as a signal, means you are going to see a full-fledged, accurate and reasonable, but very tough administration of financial regulation.
That's very good. Do you have concerns about municipal debt, debt at the local government level, because that's raking up as well?
I'll tell you what my concern is. My concern is that I wish I had some cash to buy it. Because I believe it's going to, in the first place, historically, the rate of default on what we call full faith and credit municipal debt. That is, debt that is backed by the taxing power of the issuing entity, is the safest debt. It is only slightly less safe than US Treasuries. The default rate on municipal debt is very small. What often happens is if an entity, a city is in trouble, the state will step in to cover their debts, because otherwise it would affect negatively every other city in that state in terms of the interest they had to pay. So, but the biggest difference is this: the biggest difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on the question of a COVID relief package was whether or not you aided state and local governments. Trump and McConnell were against that. The Democrats give that a very high priority. Ironically, for Republicans who objected that Democrats didn't want to fund the police, the biggest attack on police funding was the Republicans' refusal to give money to the entities that pay for the police. You know, the cops aren't volunteers. They get paid pretty well, as they should be. But what you have in the package that Biden announced yesterday is hundreds of billions of dollars of aid to state and local government. So whatever people thought about the fear of default, I think it was exaggerated before, but with the Democrats in power and the Biden administration, the fact is that the help is on the way for the state and local governments, and municipal debt is clearly a lot more secure going forward than it was a week ago.
Okay. Now, actually, I should have started this conversation, around Dodd-Frank, and but I avoided that because it was so obvious. And I think it's time that we sort of wrap our minds around what we can expect to see going forward. Something about Dodd-Frank is that there was a lot of focus in the past on the institutions, on capital charge and all of that, but not very much focus on the community level support that was being created under Dodd-Frank, right? You have the Community Reinvestment Act. You have the one my favorite really was the consumer protection aspect of the Dodd-Frank Act. What do you think would be the priorities now, to either strengthen, ameliorate, or vary, what Dodd-Frank had already achieved?
That's the biggest area where Trump managed to weaken what we did in the financial reform bill. He put people in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that didn't believe in it. Mick Mulvaney, who was the acting director, tried to kill it when he was in the House. And it will be restored to great strength. It's very popular. It's interesting that while the Republicans kept moving to try to repeal President Obama's healthcare plan, they never, for all their complaints about the Consumer Bureau, they never ever tried to repeal it or change it, because the Republicans didn't want to have to vote to weaken it. And that will be fully strengthened. That will be, the appointee of that, Frankie, will, I think, be chosen. That'll be an area of great influence by Senator Warren. And that the Consumer Bureau will be restored to full strength. Similarly, on the Community Reinvestment Act, but actually predates our bill by about 40 years, which says that banks cannot only do activity in the nicer neighborhoods and ignore the poorer neighborhoods in their services. There was an effort by the Trump administration to weaken that. The Federal Reserve, because it's a joint operation, objected to that. And so I think you will see, again, a full restoration of the Community Reinvestment Act, expanded to cover the new digitalization, the diminution of geography in the pattern of bank activity. But those consumer activities will be greatly strengthened.
Right. And, mortgage, what about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? What's going to happen to these two organizations? The commercialization of mortgage debt, mortgage risk.
Well, two things. One, in terms of irresponsible mortgage debt, et cetera, we really did take care of that in the legislation we passed. We banned, Fannie and Freddie aren't able to finance inappropriately granted mortgages because we basically outlawed those kind of mortgages. And we did tighten up some at Fannie and Freddie. But the big thing is this: for the last 10 years, there's been a consensus that Fannie and Freddie should be replaced by a federally chartered set of entities, so you're going to have competition, that would sell a guarantee to mortgage issuers against interest rate fluctuations, but not credit. The lender would still take the full responsibility for any bad credit decisions, but the institutions would be protected against great fluctuations in the interest rate, because otherwise you couldn't have 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Nobody is going to lend. The government wouldn't allow a bank to lend a fixed rate for 30 years unless it was such a high rate nobody wanted to take it out. So what I think you will see now is support for the chartering of entities that have the mandate to sell appropriately priced interest rate risk insurance to mortgage issuers so they can do the 30-year mortgages.
Right. So in other words, taking, putting a control on interest rates, but not necessarily the moral hazard of lending. Is that what you're saying? Is that
right? But they will. You can buy insurance against an unexpected interest rate. It'll be a hedge. It'll be a federally chartered ability for the mortgage issuers to hedge against interest rate risk.
Right. Barney, when you were, the Congress chair for financial services, I had this impression that there was this so-called kitchen cabinet, as it were, of, people like yourself, Lawrence Summer, maybe Timothy Geithner, sort of, coalescing to form policy and create direction. Who do you think would be the most, important, influential people coming together, and not just in the Fed, but also in the OCC, the FDIC, the personalities that are going to hold the whole relationship together?
Well, because Secretary Yellen, because she'd been on the Fed, was deeply steeped in the regulation. Gary Gensler, who I mentioned before, he is a very assertive regulator and will have a major impact as the head of the SEC on all the other regulators. They sit together in this agency we created called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. On the Federal Reserve, Lael Brainerd, who'd been an Undersecretary of Treasury, had a major role in trade. She was the defender on the Fed. She's a governor of good regulation. She helped block the Republican effort to undo Community Reinvestment Act. She'll have a major role, I believe. Senator Warren, who is a very thoughtful regulator. She goes further in some ways than I would have gone or did go, but she will certainly be an important voice in that operation.
Yeah, something that foreign banks are, concerned about, where they're concerned about where some of the, proscriptive regulation and sometimes the fines that they face when they do U.S. dollar clearing in the U.S. I was under the impression it was the New York Fed that oversaw that or had jurisdiction over it because the foreign banks are generally located in New York. But there's also the New York State Banking Authority, right? And how do you describe the relationship between the two? And what is it that foreign institutions doing clearing in the US need to be concerned about?
The New York State Fed and the Federal work closely together. One of the things that puzzles non-Americans, sometimes causes us difficulty, is what we call the dual banking system of being federally chartered or state chartered, and there's an overlap. If you have a charter from the state, you're not regulated by any federal regulator except the FDIC because you need deposit insurance. And generally, the two work very well together. I'm on the board of a bank in New York, Signature Bank. It's state chartered, but we're also covered by the FDIC, as all banks are. And it's been my experience that the two regulators work very closely together. when we have meetings with regulators or discussions with regulators, it's generally with both of them, and they have worked close. There was a case or two in New York where there was friction. New York had a very vigorous regulatory system when Eliot Spitzer was Attorney General, people remember. And I do remember at least one case where the feds thought the state of New York had been too vigorous. And some of that regulation of the foreign banks is from the state regulators in New York. I think you will see fairly good coordination of that going forward. The area
Right.
that you will see very vigorous international regulation is of the overseas derivative activity of American banks. Gary Gensler fought very hard. There was an effort led by JP Morgan Chase to say that if an American bank was doing things overseas in the derivative area, that they would be governed by the host country's laws. And Gensler fought successfully, quoting, I think accurately, our bill that said, no, we have the right to say that that can only happen if we think those laws are accurate. And the American regulators will decide whether the host country's laws are adequate. And if not, those banks will be regulated by America. And that came up in the middle of that debate. JP Morgan Chase suffered that $8 billion loss from the so-called London whale. And that said, on have American supervision.
Actually, on the financial oversight agenda, there are a number of things building. There is derivatives of American banks. That's one. The second is actually the cash position of American corporations, right? The largest ones are getting larger. We had the problem of GE in the 1990s and then into the 2000s and AIG. But today, at the top 5, top 10 American corporations, incredibly cash positive and they're not just domiciled in the US, but globally and so on. So there's this whole thing about too big to fail, and the knock-on effect of systemic risk. How do you think that's going to evolve? What are some of the issues there?
We've had very good experience, and I'm very proud of what we've seen from Dodd-Frank in the 2 or 3 areas. We have reduced their ability to do risky things, and we have increased the amount of money they have to keep on hand in case risk goes bad. The one thing that hasn't been tested is what happens when a very big institution of systemic impact goes can't keep going. We have a rule in there that says in that case, they're not too big to fail, they fail. What happens though is when they fail, the federal government will step in, take over, and to the extent that there is not enough in the entity to cover its debts, the federal government will cover enough of those debts to prevent a downward spiral and recover that money from other large financial institutions by a formula. I think that'll work. We fortunately haven't had to test it yet. I do think that that's one area when we talk about the cash position of corporations. I hadn't thought about that, but as you mentioned that, Emmanuel, that could be an area where Gary Gensler, as the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, could have a role. Because obviously, one of the things, the SEC is the guardian of the investor. It's supposedly the make sure that you don't get sold stock by a corporation that shouldn't be doing it. So that an excessively heavy debt position endangering you, that could be an area that if that became a problem. I think given Gary Gensler's personality and ability, that would be an area the SEC might step into.
So we're gonna keep a watchful eye on Gary Gensler. Barney, when Dodd-Frank came about, Bitcoin was nothing, right? And today it's like, what is it now? 40,000 US. Amazing. It's creating all kinds of potentially systemic issues. It's a new asset class. It's huge. It's unregulated and so on. What do you think needs to happen to legislation to sort of start and wrap its? I want to keep it as open-ended as possible, but what are the issues there?
The SEC has already, stepped in, and basically objected to people selling it as an investment vehicle as opposed to a currency vehicle. Obviously, the Federal Reserve and other central banks don't want to see it become an alternative currency to the extent that it undercuts their control of monetary policy. And I think you'll continue to see the investor protection, although it does seem now that the investors don't need that much protection, except apparently against forgetting their passwords. But that's not for the SEC. That's for the memory drugs. I don't know what's going to happen. I do think you can see central banks trying to restrain the extent to which it becomes an alternative currency. And then I guess you just have to, the question will be, how is it used in regular transactions? And inevitably that's going to increase. But I'll be honest, we had enough to worry about back then. And I have not looked at that the way I had to look at these other things. I'll go back to my statement that the lack of responsibility is what weakens you. And I've had no responsibility for Bitcoin, so I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, well, in some sense, it's not just Bitcoin, it's the whole technology dimension of finance, right? Now, the OCC, would take care of it if it is banking related, but now increasingly there's this thing called financial technology and non-banks, which are significant. You're going to say?
Well, there's a great deal to be gained in terms of efficiency by modernizing and digitalizing the payment system. There's no reason inherently why I should deposit a check tomorrow and have to wait 3 days to have that money. That's an impediment in the efficiency of the system. So obviously, being able to get rid of that would be very helpful.
Do you think that Lawrence Summers and Timothy Geithner would have a role in the new administration? Like, how would they be as actors? Yeah.
Tim Geithner, I think less so in terms of explicit. I think
he's in commercial now, right? Yeah.
That
he's working for.
I remember there's a difference. Tim Geithner's main job is running a company, which is pretty time-consuming. Larry Summers is part of the evolution I've talked about. The Larry Summers is, I think, more in line with the evolution I talked about with Janet Yellen, with Joe Biden. To his credit, Larry Summers has said, you know what, we have new evidence, and he's part of this new consensus, I think, that says we don't have to worry as much about too much employment, because no, that's not going to cause inflation. I think he'll continue to be an important policy voice in encouraging this more flexible approach, but also I think his saying it, frankly, gives a lot of people assurance that this is not just some left-wing flight of fancy that says we don't have to worry as much about the constraints, but a serious economic analysis based on experience.
One of the nice things I liked about the lineup for the Democratic Party presidential, selection process was the range of issues that were raised and the range of options. And I would have liked to see, a little bit of everything, in the administration. I would have liked to see Andrew Yang given a executive position, but he's not part of the lineup, and neither is Elizabeth Warren. But Pete Buttigieg is in there definitely. How representative do you think the administration will be of all the ideas that were put up during the nomination process?
Well, he said first with Andrew Yang, he's decided to run for mayor of New York, although oddly he has had to acknowledge that in the 20 years he's lived in New York, he's never voted on the office that he's running for. Not, I think, a great platform, but he was not really a broad-gauged economic advisor. He did have that basic minimum income, and I think there's generally a consensus now that income support should be more targeted. And Senator Warren will continue to be very influential. I think she will be, without question, she'll be a policy leader in the United States Senate. She's very bright. She's very knowledgeable about how to do politics. So she'll continue to have a major impact. She'll continue to be the godmother of the Consumer Bureau, but also have genuine input in other areas. Other than that, I think what you have is a pretty good range of economists who believe that government has an important positive role, both in trying to help individuals in the micro sense of dealing with unfairness, and in the macro sense of the government as a promoter of growth and equity. My own hope is, and I'm going to be arguing this, that what we need to do in America and elsewhere is recognize that growth alone is not the solution to the problem of anti-democratic feeling. And I am hoping that globally, in the developed world especially, we get more attention to equity. I think the anger at the concentration of capital that's become the hallmark of our economy, that's a driving problem. I do believe that Biden will be attacking that. I'm going to be spending my time saying I hope that they make that a very high priority. And I do think you have a Democratic economist lineup that understands that.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that evolves, because some of the Wall Street people, Hank Paulson and so on, they were very influential in the past, in the last 2008 crisis. And they're going to come up again and protect the market, and keep things favorable, to the market rather than to the street. So I'll be curious to see how that evolves. And there was a question coming in, which is that, how do you think administration is going to heal the incredible rift in social antagonism in the US? Who are the personalities that you think are the best to make that happen, on both sides of the aisle, whether they're Republican or Democrat?
That's what I started to address in the last question. I'm convinced, I'm writing a book. It says we are now facing the second time in 90 years in the developed world, the capitalist democratic world, where popular anger at the outcome of the economic system is causing a rise in xenophobic populist sentiment. The first time was during the Depression, and the response to that was Keynes. And so from the end of World War II until the 80s, following the Keynesian model produced growth enough to reestablish support for democracy. The problem is that starting in the 80s, the nature of growth evolved. It was no longer fairly widely shared. It became increasingly beneficial to a few. And ultimately, that has caused the anger. I believe that's why we're now in the second wave of populist challenges to democracy. And the answer is to not disregard growth, but to give distribution the same weight as growth, to recognize that growth that is monopolized doesn't help. The old argument was, well, the rising tide will lift all boats. But the new reality is that a lot of people can't afford a boat. And if you're standing on tiptoe in the water, the rising tide is not a good idea. So I am hoping, and I think this is the question of the Biden administration, and I think people like Yellen, they've moved more in that direction. But I think that's going to be the challenge to liberals is, can you manage a system in which growth continues, but is fairly enough distributed so it begins to diminish the anger that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking from a capital perspective. There's also the technology perspective, which is technology is commoditizing a lot of the industries that that gave that growth in the past, and so there's destruction taking place even as a new reality is coming about. And so someone needs to ameliorate that and hold it together, because there's a transformation underway.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think the two problems tend to merge, because what we had by the 40s, 50s, 60s, the productivity, the process of making wealth was widely shared because there was a role in it for people without high sophistication, college degrees. They could go to work in the factories. The problem we have today is, yes, there's the technology element, but that creates a divide between people with those skills and people without. And one of the challenge now is to see if we can better distribute the wealth that is created. One of the things that I believe will be important, labor unions under Franklin Roosevelt came into play, and the existence of labor unions, particularly in mass production, steel, autos, etc., they played a major role in creating a middle class and in transmitting the wealth so that we got social stability. I believe that one of the things we will see, I hope, in the Biden administration is support for the right of workers in the service industry, in the gig industries, to unionize. Because I think people say, well, let's bring back manufacturing. It's easier to say that than to do it. We have a substantial workforce in Uber and et cetera. Now they're talking about a union at Google. Giving them the right to unionize and do for those workers what the industrial unions did for manufacturing workers is the key, in my judgment, to social stability.
Which actually brings me right into a very hot topic that everyone is interested to know: how trade is going to evolve, right? And the personalities around who are going to like shape it. The big thing about trade, it's discussed as a winner takes it all, kind of a model that is America wins, China loses, China wins, America loses, that sort of thing. But let's construct that part of the conversation this way. There was a time, during the Obama administration, the US was a firm believer in multilateralism, right? And then the Trump administration came in, threw that all out of the door. But we're not going back to multilateralism today, are we? Because the US is got a very somewhat of a from outside of the US, you call it a belligerent stance. So what do you think the US stance will be on recreating trade? And who are the personalities who are going to be shaping that? In a world where the two things have happened recently. The former APEC countries, or rather the APEC countries as we know them to be, they've formed something called RCEP, which is very dominated by China, Japan, Korea. And then China has done a deal with the EU, a trade deal, which took them a long time getting there, but seems to have been put on paper. So the US is re-entering trade negotiations in a world where several big things have happened so far.
First of all, I agree. There's been the breakdown of the multilateral area. We should remember the biggest cause of that, frankly, in my judgment, I think it's been China's refusal to abide by the agreement which got them into the World Trade Organization. The Clinton administration supported that. I voted no. The assumption was that the premise was this will help China democratize, but even more, China will get into the WTO and adopt WTO rules. And it didn't. And there's a consensus among economists in the US, even for trade economists, that was the single biggest cause of unemployment among the non-college educated Americans of any policy decision. And you're right that under Obama, the Obama administration started out multilateral. By the end, the Democratic Party had largely abandoned that, so that the signal event there was Hillary Clinton's opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership when she ran for election. And it's the one area where it is the biggest disjunction you're going to see between Biden policy and Clinton-Obama policy. And it's going to be what was done in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. There will be two things that Biden will be pursuing. One is to do the kind of compensations for those hurt by trade that we haven't been doing. That's expanding Medicare. That's expanding access to housing. That's supporting unionization. Secondly, there will be an insistence in trade that you get fair competition in terms of worker rights, et cetera. And the significance there is one of the things that happened, the new chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is a very able, under-noticed member of Congress. He's a colleague of mine. We served together for many years. His name is Richard Neal. He's from Springfield, Massachusetts. And he's a very thoughtful, not a loud, flashy guy who is very much focused on trade that is socially responsible as an American interest. And his chief trade policy person is the new US Trade Representative, Katherine Tai. So I think you're going to see effort by the Biden administration with strong support from Chairman Neal, because the House, it's the one area where the Constitution gives the House of Representatives priority. Any tax bill, which includes tariffs, has to start in the House. So I think you're going to see a concerted effort to have that two-pronged approach, where the terms of trade themselves are fair, and where there are policies that protect those who would be hurt by trade. And if they can succeed in that, that's the basis for a renewed goal by America in trade.
Well, were Richard and Katherine, were they involved in NAFTA, the NAFTA negotiations?
They were critical. It was clear that to get the replacement for NAFTA, you needed both houses of Congress to vote in favor of it, unlike the usual treaty where it's just the Senate. And it was clear the House was going to be the major player there. And so Congressman Neal, as the chair, Democratic chair of the Ways and Means Committee, played a very major constructive role. Even the Trump Trade Representative Lighthizer acknowledged that. They helped negotiate, and they negotiated. They were in on the negotiations. I mean, they
had to negotiate. Yeah, they had to negotiate the Republicans and the Mexicans. Yeah,
negotiation between the House and the President, but also the House was in on the negotiations between America and Mexico, and said, "Hey, look, to Mexico, you want this new deal? Here's what you got to do." And so I think you're going to continue to see a very active role by the House Democrats, presided over by Chairman Richie Neal, and with the U.S. Trade Representative, his former assistant, having that role.
And what are the features of the NAFTA that was eventually, signed by the Trump administration? What are the features of that that you think will get carried over into, any new trade agreements that the U.S. gets into?
Well, there'll have to be strong labor union rights to join labor unions.
Got it.
Not bizarre that America had an administration that was saying, "Oh well, we want you to respect labor rights," when it was doing everything it could to undo labor rights in America. You're now going to have a Biden administration that's going to be strongly for protecting the rights of working people to join unions and bargain in both cases. Secondly, I think you will see now, and this is another area, probably the area where will be the greatest renewed emphasis by Biden and where he can have the most impact, is in climate change.
Yeah.
Did so much of that by executive order. And I think an insistence on policies that promote good reaction to climate change, that retard negative emissions, that'll be part of the trade as well. And finally, some human rights concerns are going to be a part of trade. You're not going to see trade easily done with countries that have been very abusive to their own people. You're not going to, and then I think you're going to see a requirement that there be an encouragement of alternative energy and against fossil fuel, and then also worker rights.
Right. Barney, I'm in Beijing at the moment, right? So, and the sentiment here is that that there is some hope that the nature of the dialogue between the US and China will be much more expanded, because there is a shared commitment to to climate change and to the environment, that when you put that into the equation, both countries have more to talk with each other than to disagree with each other. What's your sense of the number of elements that go into the conversation, and how many of them are complementary and how many of them are not very complementary? Is the fact that these two countries have a lot to discuss on climate change, is that going to create more dialogue as a result, and therefore the ability to resolve issues?
It creates a possibility of dialogue, but that's too optimistic from the Chinese standpoint. They should not be underestimating the degree of American unhappiness with China. Again, it goes back to the fact that, without question, China violated the understandings that facilitated their entry into the WTO. Since then, you have in Xi a much more, America, I think some of us are going to say that we didn't vote to get rid of Donald Trump just to play up to his Chinese twin. And Xi, Hong Kong is going to be a big problem. The Uyghurs, and I'll tell you one very big red line, and I hope China understands, any military action against Taiwan will unify a strong American response. I will tell you, I've been a liberal. I was against the Iraq War. But when you have a democracy like Taiwan, if it's menaced by this increasingly autocratic China, no, I want America to go to Taiwan's aid. And so it depends, I think, more frankly, on the Chinese. Yes, I think Biden will be willing to go forward on climate change, for example, but he's not going to be able to, or maybe even want to, if the Chinese position on Hong Kong, on militarizing the China Sea, on bullying its neighbors, and on the serious abuse of the Uyghurs, those will be obstacles. And by the way, people say, well, China's big. Yeah, you know what, America, I do believe that even economically, China needs us more than we need them. America continues to be enormously strong economically. My own view, by the way, I just wrote an article that I'm going to have published, is that we came through 2020 very strong. America, we talk about the stress test for banks. We just had a serious stress test on our democracy and our economy. And we came through both with flying colors. And so nobody should think that America is going to be intimidated or worried about being surpassed by China. There's basis for cooperation, but they have a heavy burden to carry it out.
Are there people that you would think China hawks in the Democratic spectrum? The China hawks on the Republican spectrum is very obvious. Nothing that China could do was right. But on the Democratic spectrum, is there an extreme view that there is no ability to talk with China or to, to resolve?
Very few of those, but I think you will have people who, again, there'll be a broad objection if they are menacing Taiwan, broad support for Hong Kong. I think the viewpoint I just gave you is fairly widely done. That is, nobody who's going to say, oh, no matter what the Chinese do, we don't want to deal with them. But I think the objections I talked about are fairly broad.
Well, another way to put this question is, what do you think China should or could be doing? I guess I'm already able to answer this question myself, but what would the initial things that China could do to at least start the dialogue going with the new administration? Are there issues from the trade talks that were going on during the Trump administration that needs to be resolved right now?
They could step up their ability to fulfill the promises they made to buy more things. I think those are always exaggerated. Particularly they could buy more American farm products. That would ease the political pressure, would save the billions we had to do. That, I think, is something they see. I know this question of face and said, well, they already agreed to do that. It's hard to ask people to reverse themselves, but you could at least not make it worse. They could cool the rhetoric about Taiwan. They could stop threatening Taiwan, not have a tantrum because they changed the size of the word Republic of China on the cover of the passport, etc. Those would be very, very helpful. They could stop militarizing the South China Sea to the extent they can. The other thing they could do in the economic area is they can genuinely respect intellectual property and have reciprocity. Frankly, there are important American economic interests that care less about Taiwan and Hong Kong than I do, but they're also very concerned about the way China manipulates other people's intellectual property. If they were much more protective of intellectual property and not so demanding that people who do business kind of give up to them and allow Americans to do business, if they allowed some reciprocity, that would diminish the hostility in one important sector of America.
They seem to have done that with in their trade agreement with the EU. At least on paper, that's exactly.
I suppose that they could show real good faith in the EU negotiation, because that's one of the reactions in America. Oh yeah, well the EU will find out. I mean, how do we know they're going to pay any more attention to the EU than they did with the WTO negotiations?
Right. Now, multilateralism and the US, now that the WTO is, dysfunctional, as it were, not just by American standards, many large countries find it difficult dealing with the WTO or taking the WTO route. And many countries have actually found the bilateral route a lot more constructive and faster and all that. Is America still a multilateral, a country with multilateralism as a conviction, or is it?
You don't have the xenophobia of Trump, the America First. There is a much more of a recognition that we have mutual interests, much more of a humanitarian concern for the rest of the world. You won't have Joe Biden talking about shithole countries and being so uncompassionate to others, even though, as some people have noted, Trump a couple of weeks ago at the Capitol sort of moved us in that direction. But yes, I think both ideologically and in terms of recognition of real interest, there's more support. For you just look at NATO and other relationships, Biden has been a leading voice in American foreign policy for many years, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, vice president. So yeah, I think there was a strong predisposition towards multilateralism. I think you'll see it in many cases, and a willingness to expand into China, given, however, that there are those constraints that I mentioned in the foreign policy and human rights area, and also in the nature of their economy closing up.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. We covered a lot of ground, and you gave me a perspective of the personalities that we need to look out for, how they would play out for everything from banking to trade to the environment. We ticked off the boxes on the domestic economy, and foreign policy and so on. And it looks like the Biden administration will be taking the route of at first being very domestically focused. Would you say that before it becomes before it starts dealing with some of the foreign policy issues?
Domestically focused, not as a part of a generally sort of isolationist, xenophobic approach, but domestically prioritized, partly because getting a better balance domestically is the prerequisite for having the political support to go forward internationally with multilateralism.
Does this period remind you of any period in the past in the U.S., maybe after Nixon or something like that? Does it call on sentiments that have helped the U.S. in the past that will help the country go through this phase?
It's between, frankly, now and the 1930s, when anger about the Depression was a problem, not just in America, but in Europe. And that's when you got fascism. That's when you got the assault on democracy. And I believe that in both cases, while there were other factors, the motivating force behind the disillusionment with democracy was economic dissatisfaction. The average citizen feeling that the economy wasn't working for him or her. And that's why I think that's why I think the domestic priority has to come first. Diminishing that perception is a prerequisite for going forward. I don't see much of a parallel. We have not, in the post-World War II period, what you saw was a steady move of the Republican Party to a more centrist position up until Ronald Reagan. You know, when Gerald Ford was president and then Jimmy Carter, there was very little difference between them, for example, on the issue of gay rights or even abortion. And then came Ronald Reagan. And from 1980 on, there's been a steady rightward movement on the Republican part. Finally, that triggered a leftward movement on the Democratic part, not right away. And so the extreme conservatism of the Republican Party today, there's no parallel for that in recent history.
So the thing that we should be looking forward to is greater bipartisanship and the personalities who can bring that about. Are you hopeful on that?
No, frankly, I don't want bipartisanship right now. That is, I don't want to split the difference with a right-wing band of Trump sycophants. I hope we can get to that. I do believe this. The prerequisite here is for the Republican Party has a choice to make. If they continue to be dominated by the Trump people, then no, there won't be bipartisanship. Instead, frankly, I think we will win elections because of the negative about them. What I think will have to happen is I think the Republicans, if the Republicans suffer politically, as I believe they will, and as obviously I hope they will from the public policy standpoint, that may then give the more reasonable Republicans the ability to take over their party. But as of now, it's still the Trump party. And I hope they will undo that and go back to I'll take a Cheney party, Liz and her father. But until that happens, no, there's no basis for bipartisanship.
At the same time, the criticism on the Democratic front is the rise of the elites, the rise of elitism and entitlement. You know, that has to unravel as well to some extent. I think.
Yes, what we have to do is to share the wealth. That the distribution of wealth has to become as important as how much we create. And yes, that's a big part of it. Although elitism, it's economic. I mean, the Democrats are still the party of the worst treated people in America, African Americans, most Hispanics, etc. But I do believe, yes, ending the maldistribution of wealth based on education more than anything else. Yes, that's the number one priority.
Right. And Barney, this conversation can go on. There are 3 or 4 more things that I would like to, to tap your brains on. But we've already, captured a very good sense of the people that we need to look out for in the administration as it comes about in the next week or so. You've helped us a lot on doing that. Thank you very much. And I'll see you soon, as soon as I can get to the States.
Thank you.